Hello and welcome to ADEC's In Conversation special series addressing COVID-19. I'm your series moderator, Dr. Jill Harrington, coming to you from the greater Washington, D.C. area. And with me here joining in conversation is also Mr. Isaiah Allen, Executive Director of ADEC, coming to us from Minneapolis, Minnesota. Today we welcome ADEC members and specialists in the field of loss, trauma, grief, and bereavement in children, adolescents, and families, who will be providing us perspectives and insights on the impact of the COVID-19 through the eyes of grieving children and adolescents, and also the losses they are facing, the delivery of services, and how families are coping. So joining me here today is Dr. Donna Sherman, Fellow in Thanatology, Senior Director of Advocacy and Training, as well as Executive Director Emeritus at the Dougy Center in Portland, Oregon. Dr. Brooke Griesby, licensed clinical psychologist and co-founder of Judy's House and the JAG Institute in Denver, Colorado. Dr. Erwin Sandler, Regents Professor Emeritus and Research Professor with the Reach Institute and the Department of Psychology at Arizona State University in Phoenix, Arizona. Dr. Sandler is also the Director of the Resilience Parenting for Bereaved Families. And finally, we have Dr. Julie Kaplow, who's a licensed psychologist, board certified in clinical child and adolescent psychology. Dr. Kaplow is also the founder of the SAMHSA-funded Trauma and Grief, otherwise known as the TAG Center, a designated treatment and service adaptation center of the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, specializing in childhood trauma and bereavement in Houston, Texas. So thank you all very much and welcome. Thank you for coming here and giving of your time today. I know a lot of you are extremely busy delivering services to children, adolescents, and their families. So we very much appreciate you taking time to be with us today for this very important panel. So before we get started, I thought maybe all of you could just share with us a little bit more about yourselves, but particularly the centers where you are and what those service delivery, the delivery of services, the services you provide. I thought, Donna, maybe we'd start with you.
Okay. Thank you very much. I'm sitting here in Portland, Oregon, where the Dougy Center for Grieving Children was founded in 1982. And during those years, what we do is we provide peer support groups for children, teens, and their adult family members who are grieving the death of someone in their family. We start with 3-year-olds up through young adults, and our groups are age-based and also to some degree loss-based in terms of death of a parent, death of a sibling. We have specific groups for those who are bereaved by a suicide death, homicide death, sudden unexpected deaths. At this point in time, we have 70, well, we did prior to the pandemic, we were running 70 support groups and in 3 locations in our metropolitan area. And those groups are, the bulk of those are devoted to grieving a death. However, we also have a pathways where we have support groups for families who have a member with an advanced serious illness, typically ALS, brain tumor, cancer. And actually in the last week, one of our families in the Pathways program died, and we are coping with how the differences between what you could do even 6 weeks ago and what is available now in terms of grieving a death. So that's the core of our program. I can speak a little bit later when we get to it about how we've adapted that given these circumstances, but that's what we have been doing in addition to interventions and trainings, which we're all pretty much dealing with, I think, by Zoom now or remotely.
Thank you very much, Donna. Erwin, I wanted to know if you could share a little bit about the work you do at Arizona State University.
Sure. Thank you, Jill. And thank you, Donna. Here at Arizona State University, for the last 30-odd years, we've been working with and trying to understand what leads families and children to be resilient in the face of the death of a parent. And it's involved a lot of research, and it's involved a lot of program development and evaluation of the program. And I think our contribution has been two things. One is to put the focus on the entire family, and particularly the parent, in terms, and caregiver. It's not just parents, obviously, and what they need and the critical role that they play in the resilience of their children. And the optimistic note from that, and that actually we're very excited about and I'm personally committed to, is indeed they play an amazing role. They're an amazing resource for their children and probably one of the most powerful influences on how the children do, both in the short term and the long term. So I think that's really important, and committed to kind of getting that word out. And we've developed a program to kind of support parents in doing that. And we've done research on that program and found, good effects that are long lasting. And we're very excited about that. But more than that, we're excited about trying to make that accessible to caregivers and providers in the field. So lately I've been thinking a lot about and talking with other folks about how what we've learned can be useful in this time of crisis.
30 years of work on resilience in parents of bereaved families. So very, very helpful for information we're going to need to learn a little bit more from you today. Thank you so much for sharing that. I'd like to now maybe ask Brooke, tell us a little bit more about, give us some insight about Judy's House and what you do there at Judy's House and the JAG Institute.
Sure. Thank you, Jill, for having me here with you and with my esteemed colleagues. It's a real treat to be surrounded, at least on a Zoom screen, by people that I've learned from over the years and collaborated with in many different ways. Judy's House was co-founded, my husband Brian and I co-founded Judy's House about 18 years ago in memory of his mom, Judy, who died when he was 12 of cancer. And at that time, we actually, one of the first places we went was the Dougy Center and met with Donna, and we were inspired by the power of bringing children and teens and parents together in a setting where they could support one another and also have some of their more complex needs met. What we evolved into over the years was a comprehensive center for grieving children and families that also provides services to the whole family. It's very much a whole family approach for kids ages 3 up to young adults at 25, and then their parents and caregivers. And similar to some of the other programs, including the Dougy Center and centers around the country, we do break them into different age groups and by types of deaths so that they have more likely are able to connect with each other around some of the similar experiences. And all of the services are free of charge, which breaks down a barrier to care that's important to us, and provided in English and Spanish. And we are fortunate that our community supported this work and allows us to serve about 1,600 individuals a year plus. Actually, it's growing each year, and unfortunately I'm sure we've seen increases this year as well. In addition to being a direct service provider, we established JAG Institute several years ago to house the large-scale research initiative and training initiatives of our organization. We're a clinical training site for interns and postgraduates, really focused on helping to develop the skills of grief and trauma-informed clinicians in our field, and also do a great deal of education and advocacy work in the broader community and nationally. One of the tools that we've been disseminating in recent years is the childhood bereavement estimation model. We're using that tool, which is a statistical tool that looks at prevalence. And one of the statistics that has come out of it is that approximately 1 in 14 children will lose a parent or a sibling before the age of 18. So this is a significant issue and one that is more prevalent than I think most people understand. In fact, when you look up to age 25, it more than doubles and doesn't take into account all the other types of deaths that we and other centers around the country attend to in terms of friends and other members of the family. So we're working really hard at Judy's House and with partners around the country. One of our programs, the Changemakers program, in fact, the Dougy Center is one of those Changemakers programs that are collaborating with us, are really working hard to elevate childhood bereavement as more of a public health priority so that policymakers, funders, the public at large, educators, better understand the issue of childhood bereavement, the magnitude of the issue, and also ways that we can be helpful in supporting families during times when they're grieving, but also in promoting resilience for the whole family.
Thank you so much, Brooke. I had the pleasure of visiting Judy's house several years ago, and I got to play in the sandbox and see all the tiles on the wall and see the beautiful gardens, I believe, outside with stones, and just a wonderful, and actually get to see your researchers in action. I remember you bringing me up there and showing me some of the researchers that were going on at the JAG Institute in action. So just thank you so much for joining us here today and for all the great work you do there at Judy's house.
Thank you, Joe.
So now I'm going to turn to Dr. Julie Kaplow. Julie, welcome from Houston, Texas. Can you tell us a little bit about the idea for the TAG Center and what you all do and some of the work you've done with the TAG Center?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. And I'm also really honored to be here. And like Brooke said, it's just an honor to be with so many people who I've admired for so long. So the Trauma and Grief Center began in 2012 at the University of Michigan. We were fortunate to receive SAMHSA funding to initiate that. And then in 2014, I moved the TAG Center over to Houston, Texas. And we've been there ever since. And really the goals of the TAG Center are to foster a three-part mission. And the first is clinical service, the second is research, and the third is training, all in the domain of trauma and grief. And we see kids between the ages of 7 and 17 who've experienced any kind of trauma or any type of loss. And that includes children who have experienced the death of a loved one or kids who are actually anticipating the death of a loved one. We also have a number of special programs that unfortunately we've had to stand up very quickly in the aftermath of numerous disasters. So for example, we established the Harvey Resiliency and Recovery Program that is really designed to help families who were adversely impacted by Hurricane Harvey. We also established a resiliency center in the Santa Fe, Texas area after the Santa Fe school shooting. And those programs continue to this day. And we also established a dedicated therapy mobile unit for some of our most underserved children who are experiencing lots of immigration-related trauma, including the death of loved ones. And that goes out to many of our underserved schools in the Houston area. And so clinically, those programs are, again, focused on kids who've experienced either trauma or loss or both. We also have a pretty strong research program that really looks at what are the most important risk and protective factors that can help us better understand which children are going to be resilient and continue on living a healthy, happy life versus those kids who may need more help and who may get stuck. And so that's an area that we're actively investigating to really, again, better understand what we need to do on our end to make sure that the treatment programs that we're utilizing are the most effective. And then finally, we have a very strong training program that trains both in-house trainees, including psychiatry fellows, psychology interns, and postdocs, but also we focus on the community. So we know that many of our community and school-based clinicians may not have had the requisite training in how to address trauma or grief. And so we hold large-scale trainings called learning collaboratives, where we bring together 80 to 100 clinicians at one time and train them in the very same evidence-based practices that we use in-house within the Trauma and Grief Center. So practices that we know are effective in reducing post-traumatic stress or maladaptive grief or reducing suicide risk. With regard to the research, we also have been fortunate to receive funding from New York Life that has allowed us to establish a network of sites that are all using really common denominator assessment tools and treatments to address the needs of bereaved children. And that has allowed us to really acquire a large shared data set that is, again, allowing us to really look carefully at what are the most effective treatments and what do we need to do to ensure that the interventions we're using are really meant for the different populations of kids that we're seeing at all the different sites across the country.
Thank you so much, Julie. I know that I've been very fortunate with most of you to have done projects or come out to the Dougie Center or seen Judy's house or worked on some projects together with Irwin. You all are doing fantastic work out there for children, adolescents, and families. And with that said, I want to ask everybody, you know, most of you are delivering grief and bereavement and trauma services to children. And we've had a few panels and discussions on delivering of services of death at a distance. I wanted to ask you all now, and if you want to share anybody from the panel, what are you doing now? Like how a lot of us have had to adapt how we deliver services. I know as an individual provider, I had to do that myself, but I'm interested to find out how you all are doing that at your centers.
I'll take a first stab at that, Jill, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
I think one population, actually two, that I didn't really highlight that we're also working with are, we also have Spanish-speaking groups, and we have been doing a research project in South Carolina for adapting our model to youth in foster care. And that has been about a 3-year project so far, with, of course, the multiple kinds of losses that they have. Those groups also were in-person groups, and we had finished the research study part of it, fortunately, before all of this prevented us from doing the in-person groups. But what we've been doing since the shelter in place has prohibited us from having in-person groups is we've taken our 70 groups and offered to all of our families. We have about 450 families right now in those groups, and we called all of them and basically asked if they would be interested in continuing in a virtual way using the Zoom platform, which many of us are probably tired of that word by now, or tired of dressing up to look half decent on it. But a lot of the families have decided that they want to do that. We've started those groups a couple of weeks ago, and there are obviously some adaptations that are made, but people have been really grateful to be able to see each other. Our clinical staff and working with over 200 trained volunteers have been able to get a lot of those groups going, and they're every other week. Both children's groups and parent or adult caregiver groups are happening. In addition to that, we started some closed Facebook groups for our families and for our volunteer facilitators to be able to communicate with each other and to be able to ask questions, raise issues, and have conversations in that way. And then we're available just by phone and by all the other email, text to our families. So we're all looking forward to being able to be in person again, but so far the virtual groups are going pretty well.
Can you share with us a little bit some of what you're seeing in terms of best practice with kids? Because sometimes people are really intimidated to do this online with children.
Sure. I mean, actually, I think the kids are maybe having an easier time with it than some of the adults are, because the kids are a little bit more used to, you know, interacting with people through social media. So it's nice for them in certain ways, because they can like disappear if they want to. They can just mute themselves. They can turn their video off. They can be silly. They can be sad. You know, they can be on. They can be quiet. found that the kids are pretty adaptable,
Mm.
almost like they're in person. So I think the adults have maybe a little bit of more of a learning curve around it.
Mm. Brooke, what are you finding at Judy's house? How you're delivering your services there? And any feedback on what, or comments that Donna just commented on?
Yes, it's a huge loss for centers around the country that are, whose primary modality is putting kids together in a room. And I think it's a huge loss for the kids and families as well. And I know that I've been tapping into the wisdom of the National Alliance for Grieving Children and ADEC, and all of these videos that are going around. I really value and appreciate how openly people around the country are sharing about the creative techniques they're using. I think it's a beautiful time for our field in terms of learning really quickly. I think the mental health field in general has had to learn really quickly as well. We pivoted very quickly. Our clinicians worked to pivot to a telehealth platform and to connect with families that way. We've really focused most of our energy on supporting parents and caregivers during this time. Huge fan of Erwin Sandler's research in this area, and it informed our programs from the very beginning in terms of, some of the strongest predictors of how kids will do and when they're grieving and when they're under great stress and trauma and adversity like this time is how their parents are functioning, and the protective factors that parents provide for their kids by being that secure base and that calm force. So we've really focused on listening. First of all, I think that this is a time for listening to our families and asking them what it is that they need right now. When they're not able to leave their homes, when they're not, many of our families are working on the front line, so they're having to leave their homes. Many of our families have lost a breadwinner. And so before the pandemic, and now a parent who was already struggling to figure out how to keep the family going financially may have lost their job, or maybe trying to figure out how to continue on a job while they're also having homeschooling and helping their children adapt to remote learning. These are stressors that are unprecedented for us as a country, as a world. And so it's all new for all of us, but for families who were already trying to adapt to somewhat of a new normal after a death, it's even more stressful and more challenges. So we've really wrapped around families with a telehealth platform to send resources to them, to send them. Our program is a pretty structured 10-week program called Pathfinders. And so sending them each week's information, and we've been piloting some videos of information for families as well, so that they have those resources and tools, sharing with them all of the great tools that are being put out by ADEC, NAGC, others in the field, and making sure they feel empowered and have resources and books and activities to do with their families while they're not able to come to centers or other programs, has really been where we focused our efforts, and really being as available as possible during this time for them.
So it sounds to me that, modeling the way that most of you have modeled adaptability to loss, is you're really modeling that to adapt to loss for children and their families by really trying to quickly adapt. Might not be ideal, but really adapt your services to continue to provide care to your families. So with that said, Erwin, I was wondering, how is this affecting, you do a lot of research and education and teaching. How is this affecting research and teaching, and how are you adapting?
Yeah, well, what we're doing basically, since we're not a direct service agency, we're really a collaborative agency. We work with, we collaborate with, we consult with other groups. So we have a number of agencies who have been trained in our model, which, as Brooke said, is very much of a parent-focused, caregiver-focused approach in supporting the caregiver. So, we've been trying to do what we advocate that parents do. We've been trying to listen and see what their needs are. So with one group, they've developed they're developing a podcast. Um, I, I really don't know what to call these things: podcasts, blogs, webinars, whatever, on some of our tools, and we've been collaborating with them on how to do that and what might be most helpful to parents. We have a meeting coming up this Wednesday on all the agencies that have been using our program on how we can be helpful in terms of adapting the tools that we've developed to help parents and families, but really taking our cue from them in terms of, because they're the ones that are on the ground in terms of the innovative ways that they've been able to serve their families and see how we can be helpful. I was on a call with Julie and a larger group from SAMHSA on trying to understand parents' lived experience and how we can be useful there. For me, a kind of broad-knit issue, since I'm so concerned about parents and families. If you look at it, there's a public narrative about what people ought to do, what families ought to do. And it's very oversimplistic, in some ways can be, disenfranchising or bereave families that, you're supposed to shelter in place and your kids are going to be home from school and now you'll take care of them. And it doesn't address any of the complexities and really profound challenges that bereaved families face. So I think our role and our contribution is to work with our partners to help think through and develop tools to help their families deal with kind of the, frankly, more profound and more challenging situation that they face in helping their children at a time when everybody's locked down. And so pretty much that's what we've been doing, trying to listen and partner and see where we can contribute.
So with that said, what are the impacts that you're seeing in your communities or to children, adolescents, and families? What are you hearing? What are you seeing? What types of losses, both sort of temporary and permanent, are children facing now? And particularly added on to that, bereaved children and adolescents. Julie, why don't we start with you?
Thanks, Jill. I think one of the things that we've been seeing, and this is not news to anyone on this panel, is that for those kids who've had a history of prior trauma or prior loss, a lot of what's happening right now is incredibly triggering. And for example, we were speaking with a family in New York who said that the environment in New York feels a lot like post 9/11, where everyone is on edge and terrified, and you just don't know what's going to happen next, and people feel very isolated. For children who've experienced prior losses, having a caregiver get sick with COVID-19 takes on a whole new meaning because of their prior history. So it's scary for any child, but obviously a child who has had that history of losing someone is going to be prone to having much more severe distress. And so really thinking about that, including kids who, as Donna mentioned, kids who've been in foster care, who have experienced, parents or caregivers not being there. And so thinking about how do we address the needs of those kids in particular, given that it's going to be much more stressful for them. And one of the things that we've been consulting with other sites about is just the impact that this can have physiologically on kids, where even the emotional experience is so tied in with their physiology that a lot of what they're experiencing, again, can be trauma reminders or loss reminders, based on those previous losses. So they may remember what it was like to see or hear about, you know, grandma being hooked up to a ventilator. And then they're seeing and hearing about those images on TV. And all of a sudden, you know, those very upsetting memories come flooding back. So again, helping not only the sites that we're working with, but also, as with everyone here, working with parents to think about how can we more directly address the needs of those kids, help provide reassurance and support, and help them process and label a lot of those feelings that they're having.
Donna?
Thanks, Julie. I think it's really important to also recognize, you know, the kind of domino effect of other losses and the how those are sparking past losses. So it's quite an overload for a lot of families. I think a couple of things that we heard from our families last week were really telling, and one of them was saying that the virus provides yet another way for people to be insensitive to them. and it's like, okay, give us an example. And they said, well, there's a commercial on television right now about, it's quite startling, and it's a yellow sign, and it basically says, you know, don't kill a family member, stay home. And, you know, it's like, well, we have families where a family member was killed by another family member, or we have all kinds of ways in which their experience is now minimized because everyone else is grieving a loss. And I remember after 9/11, we had a family who had 3 family members killed in a small plane crash that week. And one of the 9-year-old girl was telling some people about how her brother and her grandfather had been killed in this plane crash. And someone said, oh, was it one of the ones that went in the tower? And she said, no. And they said, oh, thank God. Like, well, but wait a minute, you know, my loss still matters, even though it's not a national one. And so there's a kind of a disenfranchisement around that. And I thought this was a really impactful statement that one of our participants said. It's like, now when people ask how you're doing, they don't mean how are you doing since the death of the person. They mean how are you doing with the pandemic. So they feel like their losses have been minimized, and you know, obviously now anyone who has a family member who is dying or who will die is going to be facing a whole different disenfranchising around how they can mourn that in community.
It's a great point you brought up. Dr. Ken Doka, who was just on our panel of past presidents, talked about how his grandmother died. She was 90 and she had died. She had a natural illness. She died the day after 9/11 on September 12th. And it was almost like his grief was invisible because it wasn't 9/11 related. So I'm hearing that, quite frankly, through many of my colleagues in the field and through families as well too, that the minute someone dies now, and you even see it on TV, if a celebrity dies, you want to know if it's a COVID related death. So what effect do you all think that's having on families? Because people, you know, COVID's not happening in a vacuum. Life is still going on, and so is death. So how are our families really grieving losses other than COVID? What are your thoughts? How are they doing? Brooke? I don't know if we can hear you.
Yeah, no, it's a really difficult time. It for all families who are grieving, and I think everything has been stated in terms of it feeling somewhat minimized. And I think that it's crucial that we make sure that all families who are grieving have the support they need. During this time, we are still having families die, or members of families die by illnesses, and also by tragic suicide deaths, other accidents, and even in my own personal life, I've seen 3 families grapple with not being able to say goodbye, with not being able to have a public funeral or a ceremony, and how that's impacting them and their ability to go through what we expect to be able to go through during this time. So again, folks are having to get incredibly creative and resourceful around how not only to find their own ways to grieve as a family and with their larger community, but people who care about them are having to figure out how to support them. And I know that I've had a hard relationship with social media, and in the past, I've really been, my kids say that I say this too much, but I say don't be divisive. You know, I think that the being on a device has been so hard for so many youth. It's part of another public health crisis that we're in right now of kids not knowing how to cope and how to adjust to stressors in general. But right now, that is such an important part of staying connected to people that I've had to really back down on that. And although I will still insist that my children unplug, and I think we all need to be careful about it, I do think that some of what people are able to do through memorials online, getting the word out. This family that I'm thinking of who had to figure out how to communicate to their school when a child died by suicide, how to get that news out to people in a way that is careful, that's trauma-informed, that's respectful of the family, but that also acknowledges this tremendous loss that they are experiencing very much alone. I mean, we collectively grieve. Most societies find ways to grieve collectively. We gather for funerals, and so now we're having to figure out ways to make up for that. You know, in the worst of situations, it's very isolating, and grief is in and of itself isolating. I think for some, finding this time as a time to be able to really kind of hunker down with their families and find that support and find some ways to remember and memorialize within their families is something that can be very helpful. And then those of us in the community who are trying to support sending care packages, sharing notes and memories and photos are a way that we can help people through this time. You know, for some, it's a time of feeling like the whole world is grieving in ways which can help them feel less alone with it. But as long as we don't also fully acknowledge the grief and loss that they're experiencing for this wide range of deaths that they're experiencing at this time.
Erwin, I think you had your hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to reinforce and just build on what Donna and Brooks said. I think there's a lack of validation in sort of the public narrative around the coronavirus. And the public narrative basically is doesn't validate the experience of bereaved families. It's about now, when are we going to get back to normal? When is everything going to kind of unwind and we all get back to work? And you know, you don't hear I think people probably are more attuned to watching public media now, and the extra trauma, the triggering effect that Julie talked about, the extra challenges, even realistic challenges of bereaved children, of what it's like to be shut down alone and worried about finances, and deal with what you're hearing over television about the virus and all the triggers that brings up. There's just a lack of validation of that. And in that sense, a disenfranchisement of their own experience, of their own feelings. So I think that's that's an extra thing that our families are facing.
Can we talk a little bit about Donna, you had your hand up, go ahead.
I just want to say, tap into something about what Erwin just said. I'm trying to minimize my exposure to the news, because the news is, you know, even pre this, typically filled with all the horrible things that happen in the world. But But I think that there's so much out there about how to be happy and how to be, and like we should all just be happy, and I think that it also invalidates when people are feeling even more loss of the person in their life who died, like, oh, the family's together. Well, the family's together, but dad's not here, or mom's not here, or brother, sister's not here. And I think we have to make sure that we balance and remember that you can hold like fear and joy and anxiety. You can be a kid and you can still be sad and you can be hopeful. That I think all of us are going to bounce through lots of different emotions, and to not overemphasize, obviously negativity, but also not overemphasize that this is a perfect time for you to all do spring cleaning and be a happy family. It's just not unraveling that way for a lot of people. So finding those balances.
Do you think that part of it is there's an over focus on the stress related to COVID, which is very stressful, and the quarantine, but it's almost like other stressors in life just have failed to meet the news, or, that people aren't dealing with other life circumstances except the quarantine?
Well, I think the stressors are there, the uncertainty, the fear. People are losing their jobs. They don't know if they'll be able to make payments. Let's face it, not every family was a happy family before. There are people going through divorces. There are people who are going through domestic abuse, children who are being abused. And, there's a certain way in which some of that will have the potential to go more undercover. So I think the stressors are valid ones, even for people who have certainties of jobs or have stable, homes that they're not worried about losing. It's a valid fears.
Sure, but maybe to rephrase my question a little bit, that, if you're a bereaved family, people are more likely to ask you how you're doing through this crisis, but not necessarily acknowledge maybe that you just lost a family member. They're just sort of asking you about the crisis and the stressors related to that. You're shaking your head, yes. Does that seem like what you're experiencing?
Yeah, looks like Julie had something she wanted to add to that, so I'll punt over to her.
Okay.
Thank you, Donna. I think that what we've also been hearing a lot of is that we've been using the term grief very freely here, right? So in the media, they're talking about kids grieving over the loss of not being part of the basketball team anymore, not being able to go to school, or parents grieving over the fact that they can't have a certain celebration that they wanted to have. And what we hear all the time now is, for those bereaved families who actually lose a loved one to death during this period of time, that can feel really invalidating, that they're grieving, but in a much different way. And so I think that's, one of the things that we've been talking about is really thinking carefully about how we use that term, and so that it's not invalidating, so that we're still certainly validating that children may be very sad and disappointed that they can't do the things that they used to do, and they really miss those things, but also recognizing that that type of grief can feel very different than a permanent death of a loved one.
Really important point, that exceptionally important point, to kind of differentiate those two. For the I'm going to turn around about those who are newly bereaved, and say newly bereaved right before COVID and during COVID. What do you think those experiences for those families are? I can share real quickly. I had a client who's he's in his 40s, and his wife recently died, unfortunately, of cancer, and they had 2 teenage children. And literally, she died right at the cusp of when the COVID quarantine happened. And he's explaining to me, it feels like they're almost stuck right now in a time warp, because they can't really try to enter back into life, going to work, to do the things the newly bereaved really try to do. while they're grieving to try to get some sense of normalcy, that everything feels just so strange and surreal, but the surrealness of the quarantine is almost freezing the family in time. And it doesn't feel like they're really able to start processing and adapting to their grief. What are you all seeing?
Well, that makes a lot of sense to me, particularly, again, because we're social creatures. And, you know, for most of us, despite whatever our traditions are, we gather with family and friends when someone dies. And as much as we can connect social, see our photos and all of that, it's not the same as a hug, as tears, as, you know, crying over a casket, as going out to a cemetery. It's just not the same. And I was reading the 4 pages of the obituaries in our local paper on Sunday, and, you know, every single one of them says either no service will be held or will be held at a later date when that can happen. And so I think there is something of like a holding pattern in a weird way. I don't want to use the word stuck, because I think that has some connotations I don't mean to imply, but that there's a surrealness and there's a holding pattern that all the other things that are happening, you know, make it even more challenging.
Brooke, I think you had your hand up.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. And as I said, we're hearing that from families in terms of the inability to have those gatherings and to have the physical comfort, as you said, Donna, especially for younger kids, to not be able to hug an extended family member during this difficult time is so difficult. And what we're also hearing though from families, and I think it's important to acknowledge and hold this, is that for some families, time when they're newly bereaved, time was feeling frozen and normal was not there for them. And we are hearing from some families that this time, although stressful and you know, uncertain, has slowed the world down for them in some ways, that they have had the time to really be with their family, to have those deeper conversations. I think that when we're grieving, it's both adaptive and helpful to have those distractions of school and work and sports, and we're missing that so much, and our kids are missing that so much. And the flip side of that is that we hear from families that they are having time to catch their breath and to have these conversations and to find ways to remember the person who died. And so I think the more that we can help families tap into some of that ability, and again, that goes back to how are we supporting families that are in our care, that we are in contact with, you know, really helping them find the ways to have those conversations. Because as we just discussed, we're very, you know, avoidant of grief and death in general in our society. It's hard to talk about, and that resonated very much for me, Julie, when you're saying that this word grief is being thrown around very freely, similar to how the term trauma has been thrown around freely for years. You know, I was traumatized when I went to Starbucks and they didn't have my vanilla flavor. And kids and adults use these terms so freely that it can really minimize the experience of those who've actually experienced ground shaking, life changing grief and trauma. And so there's both. There's that they're not having the opportunity to have those conversations, and they're having the opportunity to have deeper conversations at home. And I do hope that for some families, for families who are able to do that is a comfort for them, and that they can use this time to figure out how it is that they want to go back to school, go back to work, go back into the world and share their stories, and to memorialize and honor the person who died, or celebrate their life, or just integrate that into their life. And so I do hope that that's one of the ways that folks are able to use this time together.
Speaks very much to the uniqueness and the variability of individuals and how they grieve, and also how they adapt. So you will have people in different ends of the spectrum, to say, some in the middle, where some families may be being at home, like Donna said. Certainly home wasn't a very functional place before, and maybe very toxic, where all this time is really very much contributing to that. And then some of that could be families that this time is where they're able to talk and connect and really not have all the distractions of the outside world, so that they can connect and reconnect with each other, you know, through the loss. And speaking about that a little bit, I wanted to kind of circle back to talking about caregivers and circle back to talking about a little bit about, I know we've talked about other death-related losses, but let's focus a little bit now on COVID-19. You know, in the context of the death of a loved one to COVID-19, how can caregivers help support their children through their grief? Erwin?
Sure. First of all, it's important to know right at the outset, it's a daunting task. It really is. I mean, for bereaved families, under the best of circumstances, they're, in my mind, heroes. They're doing a heroic task. It's very difficult, and there's a lot of challenges to being able to parent well a child, and even more so for a bereaved child. When you put COVID-19 on top of it, and we all know the really hard effects. I was going to say, well, I won't say it. They're very difficult effects of cumulative stress. So you're putting on top of the daunting task of caring for a bereaved child when you yourself are grieving. If you are the bereaved parent, and if you're a caregiver, it's complicated in other ways. The real task that you cannot put off of dealing with the upside down world of COVID-19. So I want to put that up front. It's a daunting task. So anything, because I feel like anything I say almost minimizes the task. But having said that, we all sort of know what is helpful for a caregiver or a parent to do for their children. You know, we've mentioned it here. Listening is probably the most powerful thing. Creating a solid and a helpful routine is very powerful. Talking to your child, explaining the situation, hearing how they see the situation is so important, and not in a Pollyannish way. And it's challenging, as how do you give people children facts at a level they can understand, but also give them hope and give them security. That's a good task. That's hard. So this is the task, and it's just unavoidable for them. This is the task that's sort of plopped in their lap at a time when they're stressed from their own grief, depressed, which is different than grief, but also affects many of these parents, and facing all the real life challenges. So you asked me what parents can do. I think that was the question. And so with this context, the first thing I would hope parents would be able to do, frankly, is to be kind to themselves, is to recognize that if it's difficult to do, if it seems really hard to do, or if they feel incompetent to do it, to not, add on to the suffering, to the pain, to the difficulty, being hard on themselves. So taking care of themselves by not, by not being unkind to themselves in terms of the way they talk about themselves, think about themselves, in terms of their competency to do what they need to do. Superordinate, as a superordinate thing I would hope for parents, or that we could help parents be, is to be kind to themselves, to be gentle with themselves. Because I think that that frees them up to some extent, and to find ways whatever way it is, not whatever way it is, find helpful ways in which they can find comfort. Maybe ways they've had in the past. Maybe it's their religion. Maybe it's not. Maybe it's meditation. Maybe it's connecting with other loved ones. But to try and bring, maybe it's just giving themselves 5 minutes a day to just be by themselves. Maybe it, and I think this is helpful actually, is to be very present focused, is not to be focused on what's it going to be like in September, what's it going to be like in July, but what do I have to do today? And what can I do today? You know, because you don't have to do everything you think you have to do, but what can I do today, given the things that are on my plate? And I think that's helpful because we all tend to, not all of us, but most of us tend to think too far ahead, and that's functional at some times, but in a time of crisis, it's not all that functional. And to find ways, and I think this is kind of what a lot of us are saying, to find ways to realize that you're not alone, to find ways to connect with others. If you're receiving services from an agency that did, like Donna and Brooke and Julie have said, that they're creating telehealth ways to connect to other bereaved peoples, that's amazing. That's a gift. If you're not linked to an agency, there are hopefully other ways that you can find ways to connect to others who you know care about you, and let them care about you. So, you know, having said all that, it's easy to say what they can do, what they should do, but I'm going to circle back to what I said in the beginning. It's a daunting task. And I think our job is kind of, how can we be helpful?
Well, it can feel, like you said, superhuman in a way, because not only are parents now uncertain about, you know, the world could feel very uncertain and scary after the death of a loved one, and particularly a partner or spouse when you have children. And now there are a lot of children that have a lot of uncertainties, that are uncertainties about school, uncertainties about social activities, all the things that sometimes children and families look toward, you know, to regain some sense, even in a world that seems senseless and meaningless after a loss, trying to regain some footing in the world, to kind of find your identity in the things we do and the people we connect with. So how do you think, you know, what makes it so difficult for parents and caregivers to help children cope during this time? Julie, did you have your hand up?
Yeah, thank you. Well, I think that, and this has kind of been said, but I'll restate it, that right now, two of the most important protective factors that we know help families in the aftermath of a death are social support and also having closure if we know that someone is about to die. And those are two things that we don't have access to right now because of COVID-19. And so, and obviously the physical constraints we have. So I think that that's what's made it, at least with the parents that we've spoken to, so challenging, is the two things that they would typically rely upon during their process of mourning and grief are not readily available. So like the others have mentioned, you know, we're really trying to encourage different things that they can do to bring in more social support, whether it's helping kids to get onto Skype, FaceTime, whatever it is, where they can actually see the person and communicate. That's been helpful, to be able to talk with other loved ones who are also mourning at the same time. And for parents, you know, oftentimes, as Erwin said, it's a matter of getting the support they need. And again, that necessarily at this time requires that you either do that through the telephone or the computer. but really helping families to recognize that this doesn't have to be the final goodbye, that there is the opportunity for most families to have a ceremony at a later date when it is safe to be planning for that. We've heard from a number of families that that's been helpful to have that in the back of their mind, that there's going to be a future date when all of our friends and loved ones will be able to help us through this. And also for children, especially those who did not have the opportunity to say goodbye, for example, to a grandparent or a caregiver, encouraging activities like writing a letter to the person and saying all the things that they would have wanted to be able to say, or finding other ways to memorialize them, doing things that they used to love doing together as a means of having that healthy connection, or even living the legacy of the person, finding ways of doing things that they know would have made the person proud. Those are ways that parents can sort of facilitate helping children through this really difficult time. But I will reiterate what Erwin said, because I think it is so important that parents need to take care of themselves. Caregivers need their own support in order to really be fully present and helpful to their kids. So that's a really critical aspect.
So important you bring up those aspects of sudden, people dying suddenly, they're dying away from people. A lot of things that we saw sort of in 9/11. I just recently listened to an interview with a woman who was recently widowed with her young husband. He died of COVID-19. They had 2 young children. And she said it felt like he just disappeared. He left and went to the hospital, and she was unable to be with him at the time of his death. And just like sometimes we see in military families, or what happened in 9/11, or people die suddenly and away from us, she says she has this feeling like, he just is still kind of at work, even though they know he's died, they know he's buried, they buried him, and they weren't really able to have a funeral. There's this way our minds can kind of trick ourselves into maybe believing they're just at work. So she feels, in a way, and we use the word frozen, and Donna used the word sort of in a washing machine cycle, kind of in a holding pattern, of really not being able to re-engage in some of these life activities. We know that after a loss has happened, are so meaningful and so important for families, but also this sense of when someone dies and they disappear, the sense of really ambiguous loss and a feeling of that they're not really gone. Erwin, you had your hand up?
Yeah, I just want to reinforce what you say. And if you think about one of the things a funeral does and the rituals around death does, is it validates the person who died. It's the beginning of the story of what that person meant. And to have people die without, everybody witnessing and sharing that story really compounds the sense of, the difficulty of making meaning and honoring the person who died.
And then trying to make meaning of your time at home together. Donna?
I just say, I think that the punctuation of life events, I'm going to make a friendly amendment, Julie, to closure, because I know you don't mean closure as if they're not grieving anymore, but like the ability to have some sort of punctuation, rituals, all of those kinds of things is how I'm interpreting your use of the word closure there, of like, this really happened versus they went away and now it just feels like they're not coming back. And I also, we had a family who called last week, a 7-year-old father, and the father died of suicide. And we know that families who have a suicide death are typically do not receive the same kind of social support under the best of circumstances when they're grieving a death through suicide, and when people are, less caring, less thoughtful. So we'll see what happens with our suicide rates as this continues. We know that suicide rates are tied to economic unemployment and economic issues. So I just think there are a lot of things. The other thing I kind of wonder about is whether there isn't a bit of a stigma attached to dying of this virus, because we're all kind of like, we don't want to get it, and you're walking down the street and now you can say hi to people, but everybody's the enemy of this unseen thing. And it's not like death isn't there waiting for us all at the end, but we're not as conscious of it usually. And so we're hyper conscious, and our newspapers, for example, are not saying who died unless the family chooses to do that in the obituary. So there's almost like a stigma attached to, how did you get it? And I don't want to be around those people. So
Yeah.
I think that's going to make it even more difficult for the families and children who have a family member die of this virus.
Important point. Dr. Joker brought that up the other day. Very important point, that the potential for stigma with families, hopefully that's not going to be the case, but it is the anxiety and the fear that's also kind of with this disease is becoming a disease in and of itself. The fear factor and how that may impact children, because they're not only dealing with right now issues of loss and grief, but also the anticipation that they themselves may get COVID, or somebody in their family may get COVID, or someone in their family who died, the stigmatization that goes along with that. I want to talk a little bit about, before we have getting toward the end of our program, a little bit about how we can support youth and families who are anticipating a death during this time. Because as we all talked about, whether it may be from COVID-19 or it may be from other different types or circumstances of death, people are dying. And there are many people who now have to do that in isolation, and children and families have to do that in isolation, regardless of how the person died. I mean, if someone goes into the hospital, family members can't be there with them, whether it's COVID related or it's from an illness or it's from an injury. So how can we support youth and families that are anticipating a death during this time?
Well, I'll go back to the daunting statement that Erwin mentioned. Again, it's difficult under what were normal circumstances, but I think thinking creatively about ways to make connection before the person dies, and of course that depends on what state they're in terms of consciousness or ability to interact. I think, and this might sound a little bit odd, but I think it does present an opportunity for families to potentially have more honest conversations at the end of life, knowing that they may not be able to have the kinds of rituals that they would have typically. So on one level, it does open the possibility to have those more honest conversations, and also about, what do you want us to do when, and things like creating videos, photo albums, writing letters to the person, all kinds of activities if they're not able to, or some kids don't want to see the person in the hospital in that state, even through social media, and they shouldn't be forced or shamed for not wanting to do that. So I think we need to be honest with them, listen to what their needs are, and try to make those bridges as they're possible.
Excellent points. Anybody else want to provide any comments on that?
I agree with everything that Donna just said, and that making it real for kids. I think that that's something that we struggle with when they're not able to say goodbye, or for those who have an open casket, sometimes that's helpful for them to see the body. And so if there are ways for them to say goodbye and really make it more real for them, it will be helpful for them in terms of some of what not only young kids, even we adults are prone to magical thinking and thoughts of, what really happened and how could we have changed it. I know that for some, visiting nursing homes through windows, if it's safe, could be a way to have a more real connection and view with somebody who may be dying in the near future, if it's safe and if it's something that would be helpful. I think, again, it's listening to the kids and to the families and what it is that they want during this time. That's most important, because it will be so different for each individual.
One last question before we kind of end. Well, another question before the last question before we end. Let me be honest, since we're being honest and transparent. Do you think it's important for kids? I know for me in my practice, it was really important for all of my clients, my individual clients and families, to see their therapist. Do you think it's important that the children that you're working with and the families, this continuum of care you provided to those who are grieving and those are bereaved, the bereaved children and adolescents, and why do you think it's so important? I can tell you why I think it's important, but I'd love to hear from all of you. Julie?
So I think that you raise a really important point. And I think that for many of the kids that we work with, oftentimes it can be very scary to think that something may not only happen to, obviously something may have already happened to someone they care about, and now they're worried about their therapist. And that's a perfectly normal response, that they want to know that you're okay and that you're still going to be there for them. So I think actually being able to have that visual of you being present in the room and safe is really important. But also even just in terms of body language and being able to establish more of that therapeutic rapport. In my experience, it's been harder to do that if it's just simply a phone call. I think that oftentimes it's been very important, particularly for kids, to be able to make eye contact, to see each other, and to really be able to communicate better by seeing each other.
Thank you, Julie. Donna, we know that peer support is so important for children. What do you think the value has really been with your kids continuing on with their support groups through this?
Well, it's interesting because some of the groups are reconstituted, so they aren't all the same kids. Some of them are, but when they see each other, like, oh, how was your hurt? How was something they talked about 2 months ago? How did that work out for you? So there's connections happening, and they're all in the same boat, so to speak. So they also share with each other, like, what are you doing to not get bored? Mm-hmm. And they aren't necessarily the same things I would think of as an adult, or that we would think of as adults. So there's something about the peer-to-peer that, like, is just helpful. Human connection.
Would you also say the value of, kind of keeping some sense of predictability in an unpredictable world right now? The predictability that group is going to still go on. It may be different. You're still going to see your therapist. I'm still here to help take care of you the best I can. What do you?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important for kids to see that adults can handle this, even, parents, adult caregivers, but other adults in their lives. Like, we are coping well, we're taking care of ourselves to the best of our abilities, and to have some sort of predictability, like, oh, it's Dougie Center night, and they know they have one thing they can look forward to. So I think that predictability routine will ultimately be helpful as well.
So in closing, I wanted to ask you all, how do we fully acknowledge and address, there's lots of fears right now and distress that youth and families are experiencing. I mean, some of our kids were going to be going off to college in the fall, and they don't necessarily know if that's going to be happening. Some don't know if they're going to be returning back to high schools or some of their sports. Some of them are going through not only just the loss of family members, the death loss, but also the losses of the rites of passage and rites and rituals of graduation, or maybe closing out with their basketball team after 18 years or more of playing. So how could we do that while also nurturing a sense of hope and optimism for children and families? Brooke?
think that's such an important question and point. And I think that we've laid out a lot of these struggles that you just reiterated, Jill, and how uncertain the world can feel right now. And kids are looking to us, as I think several of us have said, they're looking to us to know, are we okay? Are we going to get through this? And their worldview, just as ours has been kind of shaken, not kind of, really shaken by this experience, on the heels of already having been shaken by other grief and loss experiences, they're really looking for that security that we talked about. And I think one of the things that we can really do for our kids is help them understand what they can control and what they can't control. And when things like a virus that is impacting the world, things like a death that we couldn't stop and couldn't change, feel so out of our control, really reflecting on what we can control and that internal locus of control, if you will, of we can do hard things. I think that's a mantra I use a lot with my own children, that I think kids in general really have needed help even before this pandemic, with knowing that they can do hard things, that we can cope, that we can go within and find ways to deal with and manage the very big thoughts and confusing thoughts and very big feelings and hard reactions that we're experiencing in our bodies and in our world, and develop new and stronger coping skills to navigate not only this difficult time, but other challenges that we'll face. So the deep breathing, the relaxation strategies, the mindfulness, all of these things that we've talked about, the cognitive strategies to help target and when we're wrestling with a thought that is really making things feel worse and even less manageable, that we can challenge that. We can challenge that in ourselves. We can challenge it with our counselors or our therapists. Our parents and our families can help us identify those places where we might be at risk of getting stuck or derailing part of our process. And so there's that piece of coping competence and instilling that belief in their ability to handle it. And also, I think what we do a lot with kids who are grieving at all times, not only during something like this, is to reflect on the things that have stayed the same. There's so many changes, so many things that are out of whack in our world right now and that are scary and uncertain, but to help them think about what has stayed the same in their home or in their family, the friends that they do have. They can't see them physically right now, but they do still have them and they care about them, and expressing gratitude for those parts of their life that are still there can be a very healing and hopeful part. And I agree with you completely, Erwin, that helping parents and kids be in the moment and present is key to getting through these hard days. But if we can also help them look to the future in ways that feel hopeful, then we will help so many kids, like the child that's walking in my door right now, to be able to look forward to when we do get through this, when our lives will return to, we'll be able to gather again and be with people again, and to really help them think about make plans way into the future, perhaps, because we have to be careful not to have other plans and losses around events that they will then miss again. But I think that it's so important for our kids to have that hopefulness right now and know that we can get through this. And one of the ways that I've seen be really successful for kids and adults is to be helpful to others, to find ways to help people who are on the front lines. Kids are sewing masks, kids are sending messages of hope. Some friends of mine, their kids gathered collections to buy gift certificates for meals for people who are working on the front lines. Being helpful can help people get through these hardest of times and really feel like they have a voice and they have a hand in helping the world heal, and that they too will find ways to heal and get through this time.
Brooke, such tremendous insights. Thank you for sharing. I want to also thank you for sharing that realistic viewpoint of what it's like for a mom to work at home as well, too. What we're contending with working from home. So, and how you just didn't miss a beat with that. So thank you so much for.
Right. It does happen a lot, right? And we all are having to adjust to this time.
Finding that realism. Erwin, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I love everything Brooke and Donna said, and fully, I love what you said. The only thing I would add is developmental differences. Where a sense of hope comes from for a 4-year-old and a child in middle childhood and adolescence is going to be quite different. And it's helpful if we, and this may be a place where helpers can help parents be aware of that the impact and the need for creating a sense of hope and optimism for a preschooler may come primarily through safety with their caregiver. And it's going to be quite different for an adolescent who is questioning who they are and what life means and what their place is in it. And that's critical also because they're thinking about, what they want to become and kind of individualization. And so the nature of the task is different depending on developmental differences. And, as providers of help for caregivers, I think that's one place we can make a contribution, is to make people more aware of that.
An important point about developmental disabilities, I often share with people. I have a 19-year-old adult son with autism, and he loves social isolation. So the one thing he's missing in his life right now is going out to eat. He loves to eat. Food is really important to him. So DoorDash has been a great coping mechanism for us all, just to bring a little humor, but bringing in development and developmental disabilities as well too, really trying to tailor that hope and optimism to the age and development of your child. I think, Julie, you had your hand up. Did you want to say something?
Well, I sort of feel like Brooke and Erwin and Donna have said it all. But I will just add that I do think that throughout these very challenging times, there are important lessons for kids that we can instill. And I think one of the most important is that it's okay to be vulnerable, that, that this is one of those moments, a very prolonged moment in time where we're all vulnerable. We're all nervous and anxious, and that's okay. And that it's okay to ask for help, and that it's okay to say that I'm feeling worried or I'm feeling upset, and really validating that. And then I think the other piece of this that, again, as Erwin said, really depends on the developmental level of the child or adolescent, but kind of taking inventory, using this as an opportunity to take stock of what's most important to you. And I know many adults are doing this, and I know kids are doing this too. So really thinking about, what are the most important things to me? What have I recognized in having this time at home, really being able to think about what is it that I miss the most? For many kids, it is friends and family and having that human connection, and thinking about the interactions that we have that are healthy, that we want to hang on to, and some of those interactions that may not be so healthy that we can let go of after all this is over.
So important. So did anyone want to add any ending kind of comments or feedback on our panel today? Anything we've missed? Donna, did I see your hand up?
Well, no, my hand wasn't up, but I will just say I read a poll the other day that said 45% of Americans were experiencing like mental health issues as a result of this. And I couldn't help thinking, what's wrong with the other 55%? I mean, we're all under stress. And I think, like, as Julie said, we are going to have an opportunity to focus on what really matters for each of us. I think we're going to see more divorces and more babies in, as a result of this. And I think one of the ways I try to look at it is when things come back to the new normal, whether that's 3 months, 6 months, a year, I don't know, because I think there will be permanent changes in how we interact. I want to feel like how have I used this time in a way that I feel good about, not just to produce or like put undue pressure on, but just using it thoughtfully, mindfully, giving back to others, letting the people we know that we love them, and stepping back and taking the opportunity to do that.
So important. And just kind of close on what Erwin also said, and thank you very much for that, Donna. You know, it's so important. We're around our children so much, and it is important for caregivers and parents to make sure, other than working and taking care of our families and cooking. And I don't know if any of you watched CBS Sunday Morning, but Jim Gaffigan, I believe, he's in New York City in his apartment with his 5 children, and he said he went from a comedian and a working man to now a short order cook and a cleaner. And I know I've done more cooking and cleaning and dishes than I want to, and I heard more stories from my wonderful son about stories he reads on the internet. So it's so important for parents to give themselves, and caregivers and families, to give themselves that mental break, to have that little time alone so that they can recharge and replenish themselves. So anyhow, Brooke, you said you wanted to say something?
I couldn't agree with you more about the needing to find the space and time to recharge. I also think, and I hope that for some of us, for some of our families, we're learning how to be better at being families. That we may, after we get through this, and I've heard this from a lot of folks, choose to schedule ourselves less, have less running around and filling our lives with activities. And that we will appreciate those simple pleasures of cooking together and clean. And I know it's a lot of cooking and cleaning. What we do in our family is we play cards, we play euchre after every dinner. It gives us more time to talk when our mouths aren't full of food, and it also whoever wins doesn't have to do dishes. So there are some new rituals that we as families can be developing and learning how to be better at being families together during this time, that I hope can go forward, and that we'll learn lessons from this time together that do change the way that we, as you said, prioritize our time and use our time together wisely.
Well, on behalf of ADEC, I want to thank you all for joining us here today, talking about COVID-19, the impact to children and families facing losses, and those who are grieving and bereaved. Thank you so much for taking all the time. We've held you for a pretty long period of time here in Zoom. I remember Zoom being a TV show, I think back in the 70s, so I'm dating myself now, but everybody's gonna know that name, Zoom. But thank you all for sharing your insights and your expertise here today at ADEC in Conversation. I wish you all be well, be safe, and follow those physical distancing sort of guidelines that are in place. And as someone said today on our international panel, please remember to wash your hands. So thank you again for being at ADEC in Conversation, all of you, talking about children and grief, and take care of yourselves. And for all of you who are listening, take care of yourself as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Sheila.
Thank you.